Hello and welcome to this GameTime Quickie. In this Quickie, we're going to quickly take a look at how Muskets and Tomahawks stacks up against brother, two rule sets that have rules for skirmish games fought in the 18th century. Now, I will caveat this saying that primarily Brother Against Brother was written for skirmishes in the American Civil War. However, it does contain a rather lengthy appendix for fighting games in the 18th century. So I'm going to look at it from the perspective of the French and Indian War, or what also could apply to the American War of Independence. So first off, let's talk about units and formations. In Brother Against Brother, all of your units are essentially 10-man units. And there's a reason for that, which is really kind of reflective of morale and how morale is dealt with in this game, and we'll kind of get to that here in a second. But essentially all of your units are 10 men, whether that's an Indian unit, a regular unit, or anything. And what's interesting on Brother Against Brother is you actually take officers, so every unit has a unit leader, much like Muskets and Tomahawks, and then what you'll do is every 2 to 3 units will have an officer, and that officer is kind of running those 2 to 3 units. And as a comparison to Muskets and Tomahawks here, units are a variable size, generally from 6 to 12 figures, and they can vary even within their own troop type based on the army list. And you can get officers essentially for at least every 10 men of the same troop type, and of course you'd have to run at least one unit of that troop type in order to get the officer. And so you can have multiple officers in both games, except what's a little bit different with Muskets and Tomahawks is the officers can only influence their troop type, so they're not actually assigned any particular group of units like they are in Brother Against Brother. So that's a little bit different, although you know, variable unit sizes versus kind of fixed at 10. And I mentioned morale, and I was going to kind of cover that later, but it's kind of important to put that in perspective now. So in Muskets and Tomahawks, when you take casualties, you'll take a reaction test. And that reaction test is heavily based on your troop type. So regulars are far more likely to stick around than irregulars or Indians or militia and civilians for that matter. In Brother Against Brother, everything's kind of equal. When you take casualties from shooting, you're going to take a morale test. And essentially what that is you're going to draw a card up, and it's going to tell you how to resolve the morale test. And you've got a little deck of morale cards. The most common one seems to be take the, so this is a 10-sided die system versus a 6-sided die system, so keep that in mind. What you're going to generally do for most morale tests in Brother Against Brother is take your remaining models. So let's say out of my 10-man unit I have 8 guys left. I'm going to roll a d10 and subtract how many people remain in the unit. So let's say I rolled a 9 and I subtracted 8, giving me a net result of +1. A lot of the morale cards here say if you get a negative result, you fail the morale test. Or sorry, you pass the morale test, correction. And if you have a positive result, you fail. So in the case of I rolled a 9 and I subtracted 8, I would have a net result of 1, which means one person would skedaddle from my unit because that's the difference between that and 0, which is really what you need to pass. And so you would essentially remove one guy from the unit. If it was +3, 3 guys would skedaddle. If it was 0 or less, then they would essentially pass the morale test. Over here you have different results like recoil, where the unit will move back 1 move facing the enemy. A flight, which is they'll move 1 move away from the enemy turned around, and they won't take any more activations or actions that particular turn. And then you have a rout, which is just pick up the whole unit. And of course in both systems you have okay, you know, you've passed your morale test. So what's interesting here is I actually favor Muskets and Tomahawks from this perspective because it really treats the different troop types, you know, regulars, irregulars, civilians, Indians, as different qualities of morale, whereas over here your regulars are just as likely to break as your irregulars or your Indians or your civilians, because it's essentially just based on how many people are left in the unit. Of course there's other special cards like you just, you know, run away essentially, or you move one move away. There's different morale cards, but they're not tied to any particular troop type. It's one morale deck that everybody uses when they have to take a test. Okay, so that's units, formations, and morale. Let's talk a little bit about movement. So movement is very different. So in Muskets and Tomahawks, in both systems you have a unit leader. And in Muskets and Tomahawks, everybody in the unit has to stay within 1 move of the unit leader. And that's also the same for Brother Against Brother. The difference is that in Muskets and Tomahawks, your movement is by individual figures. And of course you'll pay movement penalties on a per figure basis. So if 5 guys move in the open, they're in the open. If 3 of the guys from the unit move over a stone wall, then those 3 guys have to take the -2 inches for going over an obstacle, unless of course they're scouts. So there is provisions for regular troops being a little more nimble than, say, regular troops. So again, I kind of like that system, especially since you're playing a skirmish game. You want it to be a little more detailed. On brother against brother, it's pretty straightforward from a movement perspective. You move the unit leader, who is the only guy that matters, and then everybody else in the unit just has to be placed within 6 inches of that unit leader. And so guys can move a lot farther than their quote-unquote movement distance of 6 inches or whatever their movement rate is. And so you get a lot of the stuff where, and again, another key thing here is that the squad leader is the only one that will take terrain penalties. So if I moved, for example, this tree here, if I move my squad leader up just outside of the woods, I could place the rest of the unit inside of the woods at no movement penalty, because all I have to do is take penalties based on where the unit leader has moved. And so it's a little more flexible, perhaps, in that you can kind of quickly move, since you don't have to measure each individual guy, but there's a lot of room for fudging with the game, because you can just kind of use your unit leaders to kind of push guys into terrain without having to pay penalties. So I think in maybe a larger con game, it might help things kind of move along a little bit differently or a little faster. But you know, I've run some con games of Muskets and Tomahawks, and it's been just fine. I'd say from an activation perspective, very different, and probably the most fundamental differences, even though they're both card-based driven systems. So where you have a deck of cards for Muskets and Tomahawks that has a bunch of cards related to the troop types involved in the games. In brother against brother, you have a standard playing deck of cards, and each card represents a specific unit. So when it comes up, that unit gets 1 action. In Muskets and Tomahawks, during the course of 1 turn, which is your deck, most units will get 4 actions. In 1 turn of brother against brother, which again is going through that 1 deck, every unit will get 1 action. So at least it's a little more predictable, but at least in Muskets and Tomahawks, you're getting multiple actions per turn. So I'd say the average game length for Muskets and Tomahawks is about 4 turns, and that's about 16 actions, or maybe a little less if you're civilians or provincials or something like that. And brother against brother, your average game length is going to, or number of turns is going to be a lot more, because each unit's just getting 1 action per turn. And although you don't know when those actions are going to come up, it's just going to be 1 action. Over here, you're going to get 4 actions, but you don't know exactly when all those 4 actions are going to come up, because they don't come up all at the same time. If you watch our episode of Muskets and Tomahawks here, which should be posted in the next day or so, you'll see exactly how this system works. Let's talk a little bit about shooting. So shooting's fairly similar in terms of how it's resolved. The ranges are a little less in brother against brother, because essentially you're going in increments of 10. So 0 to 10 is kind of short. 20 inches for a musket is kind of the long range. A pistol is 2 inches, so very short. And Muskets and Tomahawks here, essentially you're going out to 24 inches for a musket, 12 inches being, and less kind of being the closer range. But in terms of how it's resolved, it's very similar. You're going to shoot, see how many people you hit, and then you're going to see how many people you actually end up killing. There is no saving throws from shooting, and then any casualties are going to either cause a morale test over here or a reaction test in the Muskets and Tomahawks terminology. And so very similar from a shooting perspective. Melee, also very similar. You're going to essentially take your movement to move into contact. You're going to essentially see how many people get stacked up against each other. I will say in terms of the actual resolution, in Muskets and Tomahawks, it's a little more abstracted. So it's really just take your guys that are in base contact, whether that's 6 guys, 8 guys, or whatever, roll all those dice at once to see if you've made your aggressiveness score, which for a lot of units is 3+ or 4+. And those are your hits, and then the other side gets to roll its defense dice to see how many of those hits get saved. And brother against brother, there's not really those saves. What you're doing is actually stacking up guys individually against each other. And what happens is, if I get a 2 to 1, I actually get a free hack. So you fight the first. Let's say I had 2 guys and 1 guy. You'll fight the first, do the first roll, kind of even up. So your opponent rolls and you roll. and essentially whoever's higher gets killed. If it's a tie, then nothing happens. If the guy doesn't get killed, the single guy, then the other guy actually gets a free hack. So he doesn't get to roll another dice against him. Just the second guy that's attacking would get to roll. And if, of course, he beats what he rolled the original time, then he would kill that guy. So a little more kind of individual in terms of how you stack people up. All right, so that's melee. We talked about morale. A little bit about army lists. So essentially, army lists in Brother Against Brother are non-existent. The only real stipulation is that you have units of 10, and then for every 2 to 3 units, you're going to have an officer that kind of controls and influences those units. For Muskets and Tomahawks, there's very specific army lists that tell you what all the unit statistics are, what they're armed with, what their options are, what their points value is. So there's a point value system in here, so you can try and build even point games. You have to kind of think about that and put it all together over here, because there is no points-based system or army lists for Brother Against Brother. And that even goes for the American Civil War stuff, so far as I can tell. Now, that could very well be because it's an American Civil War list. You pretty much have infantry, cavalry, and artillery, and the infantry's units aren't really that different. So I could kind of see where an army list might not be totally necessary, whereas for the 18th century you absolutely need army lists because there's just so many units at play. A little bit on the extras. So extras really comes down to there's subplots over here, there's the scenario generator, there's random events over here, so there's a lot of extra flavors. Officer traits, so you can customize your officers. Talents are actually what they're called for officers. Traits for the units allow you to customize the units. Over here you can obviously have the same kind of customization for your officers. So there's characteristics they can get that makes them reckless or whatever it might be. So there's a little bit of that flavor over here, but the scenario is really just one scenario included for the book for the 18th century and a couple for ACW, but there's no scenario generator. Again, because there's no army list, there's no real options for the units, although they do lay out some very generic options like elite and skilled for shooting. So there's a little bit of that flavor over here. That's kind of my high-level review of how they're different. You know, for me, obviously this rule set was written way before Muskets and Tomahawks, but you know, for me, I'm a big Muskets and Tomahawks fan. That's the rule set I'm going to keep playing. You know, there's some friends of mine that have and play this rule set, and of course, I'm happy to play it whenever they want to. But for me personally, I think Muskets and Tomahawks has a lot more flavor to it. Generally, just from a rules writing perspective, the rules are a lot clearer in Muskets and Tomahawks with lots of examples. Pretty much everything in Brother Against Brother is a single page, and there's a lot of kind of obscurity in some of the rules and how they're interpreted. You know, for example, when it comes to movement, so in Muskets and Tomahawks, when you're in formations like firing line, you can just move, and again, as long as nobody exceeds their movement rate, you can be in firing line, you can be in skirmish, whatever. It's very simple. Over here, there's actually different rules for being in a line versus being in a column versus being in a kind of double rank line versus being in skirmish. And whenever you want to move into a formation, the unit leader doesn't get to move. Everybody just moves to him and forms at that point. Of course, if you want to move into skirmish, then you can move them out and move in the skirmish formation. But it's a little more, I don't want to say confusing, but it's a little more strict in terms of how it deals with forming and going from formed and going into a skirmish and back. And so, you know, if you think about it, it's really just one action per turn. If you're going to burn that action doing a form, you don't get the move, you just bring everybody in. That's the end of your action for that turn. So I think that the pace of the game goes a little more slower when you're going through the deck for Brother Against Brother versus Muskets and Tomahawks, where there's 4 actions per turn. So I think this moves a little bit quicker. Even if you don't get through this deck faster because you're taking 4 actions, you'll go through this deck faster because there's just 1 action per unit, and once you're done, you're done. But I'd say that the game terms are far more impactful individually on the Muskets and Tomahawks side. So there you have it. You know, feel free to try both sets of rules. I certainly have. But you know, if you're starting out and you don't know where to start, I would start with Muskets and Tomahawks and maybe dive into Brother Against Brother later on. All right, thanks for joining us for this quickie, and I look forward to seeing you guys watching our Muskets and Tomahawks episode, which we're done part 1 and part 2 at this point. I'm ready to post. We're just filming some of the part 3 stuff, and I need to edit it and get it up, but that should be up definitely this week, if not within the next day or so. So thanks for joining us. See you next time.